Hello again, and welcome back to another video build. This time around, it's the crown for the god of mischief, a Loki. Oh, and by the way, I also made this custom display base for it, and I really hope you enjoy it.
You're driving me crazy.
I just love all things Marvel. But I believe you might have guessed that by now. And this Loki hero prop movie candy is no exception. Secondly, there is another reason for making this smaller, kind of straightforward prop build. And that's because I have a new material, paints, ideas, and definitely some painting techniques I want to try out. I guess you can say this is a sort of test build exercise for a bigger project that's coming up. And that all starts with this raw FDM print. It's a really good 3D model by Do3D. Just slap some gold paint on there, and you're ready to go to your convention. Or just put it on for a quick run down to the 7-Eleven. I believe this would work perfect as is. But as always, I'm looking to make it more of a display piece, and for that I would need something to hold it. A display base, sort of like a throne. I believe Loki would approve of that. So the first thing I needed was to make a really good design. I've made something kind of similar before with the Infinity Gauntlet. However, this time, it would need to be something lighter. Something that would flow perfectly, with the same shape, the same angles, and the same lines as the crown. And aside from the aesthetics, I also had to engineer a simple attachment to hold the crown. Once I found the shape that I believed could do the job and fit the overall design, I moved on to the 3D modeling. That meant Fusion 360. Now, I'm still no expert in Fusion, so I can't really teach you anything, but I can show you the broad strokes of how I go about doing this. I start by drawing up a sketch from the front. Then I pull out the model even more than I need. It looks kind of weird now. This is followed up by drawing a sketch from the side, which I then cut out the negative form of the model. And by doing these two simple steps, I already have a basic model to work with. It's not to say it's the best way to go about this, but for someone like me, who's worked all kinds of art with his hands the last 40-ish years, it's an almost tactile way to go digital, and it works for me. Who knows, it might work for you too. And yeah, I probably should mention the most important part. You know, the thing that would hold the crown. It needed to support the weight, the angle, and look good. And it's always a good idea to test it out physically, before printing out the whole model. And they seem to fit perfectly. From here on in, it's all easy and fun. It's mostly bevels, and simple adjustments to the angles, smaller bits and shapes, and basically tweaking it until it fits your vision. And this idea can finally stop crawling around in my head. And it's like the man said, Loki is a bit of a diva, so adding a gemstone only seemed fitting. Hence, the Emerald Gemstone. And there you have it, my final design. I was feeling kind of Loki about it, so I added some colors, just to show off a bit. The next step was to get it all printed. Unlike most of you, I used Cheeto Box. My settings are pretty standard, I believe. However, it might be interesting to compare the costs, just as a curiosity. Depending on where you live in the world, I believe this is a big difference. Yeah, let's move on. The crown and horns were printed in tough resin. A quick go in my homemade UV box. And we were good to go. It looked great at first glance, but I like to put on a coat of primer first. It better shows how good the print really is. And I'm not sure if my Saturn printer had a screw loose, Or it being my first print with tough resin and not having the right settings maybe. Or maybe it just had a bad day. But this was definitely my first worst print on the Saturn. So this would need quite a bit of cleanup. I'm not going to bore you with the whole sanding process, but rather share some quick tips on it. These are the main tools I use. And I start with removing the rough spots left by the support structures. Then I go straight to the 400 grit sanding paper. I make sure to wrap it around something flat. It makes it easier to keep the sharp edges of the resin intact. For the bevels and round parts, I just use a folded sanding paper. Always trying to do circular movements, so as to better avoid digging in a crevice by accident. And using something to hold it flat again, I make sure to follow each unique angle of the surface. This might seem like a smooth curved part, but this whole side actually consists of several different facets. It helps to cut up some sanding sticks, makes it easier to get to the smaller areas, while still keeping it level. This all makes a lot of fine grained dust, so make sure to wear the right breathing mask. The last thing I do is to lightly go over all the parts with a high grit folded sanding paper. And when it all looks and feels okay, I give it a couple of coats of filler primer. For attaching the horns, I actually used some 2-part epoxy glue. Pretty sure this is way overkill for a lightweight resin prop. But in my experience, using superglue is quick and easy. But over the course of a few months, it becomes kind of crispy and porous, so a slight knock would send them flying right off. When the display was finally finished printing, I couldn't even wait for the print bed to cool down, so that I could pull it off. So I did a test fit right there. Now, it might be tempting to pull a Loki and say it all went as expected, but honestly, I was just extremely pleased that it fit perfectly, and on the first try, cause that's not always the case. It was still missing a piece, but already I could tell it had a good balance to it. And you can see how the shapes and lines match the ones on the crown. So by making them have the same expression, so to say, I was hoping to make the two pieces seem like one. And I know it's not the most complex thing, but the feeling of having an idea, getting it on paper, then making a 3D model of it, then now having a physical model of it that works as it should and looks great. There is something really satisfying about that. I believe we can agree that resin isn't the cheapest material, so the base was printed in good old PLA. This means a bit of sanding, and the process is basically the same as before. Just sanding and priming. Ultimately, you get that smooth, crisp, clean finish. So let's cut ahead to the lights for the Emerald. I went with these pre-assembled RGB LED lights. You know, the ones you get cheap online everywhere these days. Later on, this would prove to be a mistake, but I didn't know that yet. Installing them, however, was pretty straightforward. I just made sure they were close to symmetrical on each side, glued it down, and then simply cut off the leftover strip. Then the final preparations before painting. Masking off the LEDs. And lastly, taking 5 minutes to wet sand all the surfaces. This gives it a really hard but ultra smooth surface. A perfect starting point for painting. Normally, it's said that when painting something gold, or metallic gold-ish, you would want to go with a red base coat. That will give it a warmer, natural color tint. But personally, I feel it becomes a bit too yellow for my taste. And as you can see, having done quite a few scrap testing pieces, I already know which way I want to go with this. And that all starts with a black high glossy base coat. Next, I would be airbrushing some All-Clad's brass paint. And I admit, you could, however, just as easy hit it with a gold or bronze rattle can spray paint. Next up was the Emerald Gemstone, and this is actually the first time I've ever gotten my hands on this Elegoo resin, and I'm really happy to discover that it really is as odorless as people say. But like all resins, it is toxic. Still, it kinda looks like liquid candy. The result was fantastic. It only showed a few lonely layer lines towards the middle. That's probably my fault for not choosing the optimal printing angle. But that's a quick fix with just some wet sanding. A thorough cleaning later, and I suspect with some clear varnish we would get just the right deep green color I'm hoping for. The next day it's fully cured. All the different parts of this build was looking really good at this point. Now, if I was going for a shiny gold bronze metallic look, and just get as close as I could to the reference photos, I would definitely call it done at this point. But how can you make a static display prop look more interesting? Well, for one, you can always add a little or lot of weathering. But for a Diva gold crown, and especially for a clean-cut guy like Loki, that doesn't make any sense. So I was thinking maybe textures, and by taking my inspiration from the early Loki trailers, remember the playful fonts? Simply put, this is the color combination and some of the textures I want. That's why I ended up making so many different scrap test pieces. And some may look very much alike, but trust me, they all have very different approaches. And to get those metallic textures, this is the way I did it. The first step is the black acrylic paint. This is simply dry brushed on. I found the best strategy is to take your time and slowly build up the brush strokes. And I'm really trying not to make too many curves, but kept going in straight lines and changing the direction quite often. It really looks like a fail at this point, but it's just a part of the process. Next I used the gold wax. I chose a bigger brush this time, and then applied it in the same fashion as the black paint. And if you're wondering why I put my paints on the plate first, and then kind of brush it around on a paper towel, well, on the plate I can control the amount, while the paper towel, it sucks out the moisture. That gives me more control when I dry brush. The Tamiya Gold is next, and the technique for applying it is still the same. Only this time, it's more on the edges, using it more to make up the highlights. And have you noticed? I have now used acrylics, wax, and now some enamel paint. That's on top of an all-cloud lacquer, with varnish still to go. This is why the scrap test pieces come in handy, and ultimately it helps to simplify the process. It's starting to look a lot better now, isn't it? And I love the fact that it gives off so much light and reflection. Next up was the crown. However, it needed to be set a little apart. It was going to have the same look, but yet not be identical. If that makes any sense? It started with the black paint again, still dry brushing, but it was only kept in the darker corner and crevices. And then I simply skipped the gold wax and jumped straight ahead to the Tamiya Gold paint. Then using a big scruffy old paintbrush, it was dry brushed all over, but this time in circular motions. Again, just to get that bit of difference. I believe it ended up looking really cool. Same, but different, right? You'll get to see the final result along with the rest in just a minute. But first, finishing up the emerald. I painted the inside a dark green before removing the liquid masking. For the actual gem, I applied an ultra matte varnish on the inside. I was absolutely sure this was going to be enough to diffuse the light. Clearly, this was a fail. And a long disappointing story kept short. I went through every fix I could think of, concluding with the simple fact that I had simply chosen the wrong type of lighting to begin with. Hopefully you can tell me the best solution to this problem. But until then, I ended up going through a whole combination of things, of which green colored cotton made it look kind of decent. I promise you, I will redo this part of the build. But for now, and that was the last part of work I did on this prop build. Yeah, that was a pretty long video for such a small prop build. But this time, I did want to show you the whole process I go through. And as you probably can guess, there was also a lot of testing off camera. All of this, mainly to get the practice for a later bigger build. I can't show you what it is just yet, so stick around. And that was it for this video build. I really hope you liked it. Make sure to subscribe and hit that bell, and I will try and share my next build with you. Have a good one, and thank you for watching.